Here it is in the year 2015, and we as a nation are still debating if torture is or should be practiced by the United States of America. I personally find this very disturbing. And sadly, this is not the first time that we have had this debate in our country. During World War I, it was discovered the military used forms of torture as punishment on U.S. soldiers. These were soldiers that were guilty of desertion or for being a conscientious objector. Now, when the public learned about these practices, the outcry forced the military to stop. There have also been times that there have been law enforcement agencies in the United States that have used torture on suspected criminals. Area 2 of the Chicago Police Department was accused of torture during the 70s and 80s. Over 87 men alleged being tortured at this Area 2 in order to obtain their confessions. The Chicago police commander, John Burge, was eventually arrested by the FBI in 2008 based on an investigation by the Department of Justice. However, he was arrested for perjury for lying about the use of torture rather than charged with the crime of torture itself. Now, with the recent release of the Senate report regarding the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques used by the CIA, this debate has taken on new emphasis and brought on new questions. First of all, is torture actually illegal under the laws of the United States? Then what constitutes torture? And then last, is torture an effective and an acceptable means of gaining a confession and or information? Now, the summary report was released on December 9th, 2014, and it was a major story in national news. But just less than a month now, and this story has already diminished in the spotlight. Why is that? Well, in this podcast, I will attempt to answer some of these questions and present some new questions that should be addressed as well. First of all, let me introduce myself and why I think that I am qualified as an expert on this topic. My name is Robert Ishoy, and in 1987, I completed my degree in history from California State University, Fresno. In 1988, at the age of 30, I joined the U.S. Army, and I became an interrogator. I was sent to the Army School of Interrogation at Fort Huachuca. I then went on to serve in the 82nd Airborne as a paratrooper. In 1990, I went to Saudi Arabia with the rest of the 82nd to liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein. During Desert Storm, I did my job as an interrogator, conducting multiple interrogations on Iraqi POWs. And I can tell you that we obeyed the law and we obeyed the Geneva Conventions in that conflict. Well, after the war and my enlistment ended, I got out of the Army and went to work in the private sector as a security professional, working my way up to the position of Director Security for a large food service company. As a security professional, I have conducted hundreds of interrogations on employees suspected of wrongdoing. Now, these are referred to in the corporate world as investigative interviews, but let's call them what they are. They were interrogations. I left the private sector in 2005 due to a downsizing, and in 2007, I found myself back at Fort Huachuca as an interrogation instructor for the Department of Defense. So from 2007 to 2013, I have trained at several different courses teaching Army, Navy, Special Forces, and even some agency personnel like the DIA on how to do interrogations. So in summary, I have over 20 years experience as an interrogator and as an interrogation instructor. And as an historian, I have studied the history of torture in general and the use of torture in all its forms. So there you have it. That's my background in a nutshell. Now let's address the question being debated in the media by both those who oppose and those who support the actions by the CIA. The first question being, is torture against the law? Well, to answer this question, let's review the history of torture and the related international and U.S. laws. Torture has been used throughout time by nations and even religious organizations since the beginning of recorded history. Torture has been used as a form of punishment, as a means to obtain confessions of the guilty, and as a means to extract information. And worst of all, sometimes out of pure sadistic pleasure. Often, it was a combination of all the above. The greatest example we have historically of the use of torture was during the Middle Ages, under what is called the Holy Inquisition, that was directed by the Catholic Church and the monarchies of Europe. Individuals suspected of such crimes as heresy and witchcraft were tortured in the most nightmarish ways to get them to confess, expose others, and then as a punishment for their sins. Now, it is more than likely that it was the horrors of the Inquisition that led the European nations during the Enlightenment period that followed to abolish torture altogether. For it was during the Enlightenment that nations began to pass laws against the use of torture. Now, King Frederick of Prussia was one of the first monarchs to do so in the mid-1700s. Now, what about the United States? Well, our country was founded during the same Enlightenment period, and most of our founding fathers believed in the same principles regarding basic human rights. The Eighth Amendment of our Constitution, which prohibits the use of cruel and unusual punishment, is a clear example of the intent by our founding fathers to abolish torture, at least as a form of punishment. But what about torture for other reasons? Well, to answer this, we need to review all the laws and treaties on the subject. Well, first of all, during the Civil War, there was what was called the Instructions for the Government of Armies of the United States in the field. Now, this was issued on April 24th, 1863. And under Article 16, it states, military necessity does not admit of cruelty, that is, the infliction of suffering for the sake of suffering, or for revenge, nor of maiming or wounding except in fight, nor of torture to extort confessions. It does not admit of the use of poison in any way, nor of the wanton devastation of a district. It admits of deception, but disclaims acts of perfidy. And in general, military necessity does not include any act of hostility which makes the return to peace unnecessarily difficult. Now, following this, we also have the Geneva Conventions, the last of 4 conventions that was written in 1949. These abolished torture during times of war and on enemy prisoners of war. Then there is what is referred to as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations in 1948. Under Article 5 of this declaration, it clearly states, quote, no one shall be subject to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. Now, this was not just during time of war. This declaration was for all times and in all circumstances. Eleanor Roosevelt of the United States was our representative on this UN committee that drafted this declaration. Then next, we have another convention referred to as the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, which again originated in the United States on December 10th, 1984. This one was signed by President Ronald Reagan in 1988 and then ratified by the Senate in 1990. In response to this international treaty, the United States then followed up with our own law against torture under United States Code 18-2340A. This one states, this is the U.S. law, whoever outside the United States commits or attempts to commit torture shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 20 years, or both, and if death results to any person from conducting acts prohibited by this subsection, shall be punished by death or imprisoned for any term of years or for life. The law goes on to state that the jurisdiction of this law covers any national of the United States, and a person who conspires to commit an offense under this section shall be subject to the same penalties other than the penalty of death. So there you have it. That's the U.S. law. Now, with all laws, there is both the spirit of the law and then there is the letter of the law to be taken into consideration. However, when we combine all of the above of the United States, all of the laws that I've just talked about regarding torture and human rights, it is pretty clear that torture and any form of cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment is forbidden, period, both by definition of the spirit of the law and by the letter of the law. So yes, torture is against the laws of the United States. So the next question that needs to be answered is, were the enhanced interrogation techniques used by the CIA forms of torture or cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment? Obviously, there are numerous forms of torture in different degrees as well, and I don't think any law can be written that addresses in detail all of its forms or degrees. That is why we have a judicial system. In the wisdom of our founding fathers, we have a system of checks and balances, a legislative branch to create laws, the executive branch to enforce those laws, and then a judicial branch that is charged with the responsibility to interpret laws and determine if a law is constitutional. So perhaps to answer the question regarding the interpretation of the laws on torture, and if in fact the CIA violated these laws, we should turn to the Supreme Court, if we truly believe in the order of things as designed in the Constitution. Certainly it is not my place to make these determinations any more than it is the place of Dick Cheney, the former vice president, or any one senator, or any media personality to do so. But if anyone was to ask for my opinion as a professional interrogator, then yes, I do consider the methods used by the CIA to be forms of torture. The very purpose of their use alone suggests this to be true. The purpose being to extract information by means of acts that inflict pain and suffering. Next, let's address the question of whether or not torture in any form as a means to gather information or intelligence is even effective. To help answer this question, our best evidence, believe it or not, comes from Nazi Germany. During World War II, there were two very different methods of interrogation used by the Germans. On one side, there was the use of torture. The best account of this is the interrogations conducted by a German officer, Klaus Barbie, and his secret police on the French resistance leader Jean Moulin. Klaus Barbie tortured Jean Moulin to the point that Moulin finally slipped into a coma and died. Now, Moulin never did talk. He never did give up any information, even after all the brutal beatings and torture. On the other side was a German officer by the name of Hans Scharf. Hans was charged with interrogating U.S. soldiers and pilots. He never used torture, and in fact did the opposite by befriending the U.S. prisoners and treating them with kindness while using more advanced persuasive techniques that did not include any forms of cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment. So where Klaus Barbie failed, Hans Scharf succeeded. In fact, Hans was so successful in gaining information from the American soldiers that after the war ended, the United States military invited Hans to the United States to teach us how he did it. We were so impressed with Hans that we even incorporated the principles of his interrogation that he used into our own Army School of Interrogation. So from Nazi Germany, we have a real-world example of an alternative to torture that is proven to be more effective and at the same time legally, morally, and ethically acceptable. This is where my personal experience comes into play. I can state as a matter of fact that there are other methods of interrogation that, without the use of torture or any form of cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment, do work, and when used by an experienced, trained professional, are highly effective, and I would even argue are more effective than any form of torture. I am so confident that these methods work that I am launching my own course of study titled The Secret Art of Persuasion, which is designed to teach these same basic principles on the higher methods of persuasion to the general public. And if the CIA lacks this understanding about these preferred methods, I would be more than happy to share my knowledge with them. Now, there are not a lot of professionals that have these skills, but they are out there. And I personally know that they were available in 2001, 2002, and 2003. Some of them were in uniform, and others were working as civilians. These are people I personally know that were available. So the question comes to mind, why weren't any of these professionals who had the knowledge and the skill set consulted by the CIA before they decided to put together an interrogation operation that was going to include torture? Well, let's consider first of all how the CIA operates. The CIA obviously conducts most of their operations in secret. The term covert is used when describing operations that are not meant to be known by the general public. Basically, the CIA works in the shadows. So it is not the practice of the CIA to go outside of their agency for anything. This is understandable considering what the primary mission of the CIA is. The concern, though, is who is really overseeing these operations and assuring that the CIA is operating inside the law. If we are to believe what some former agents of the CIA tell us, the CIA has a history of violations regarding the use of torture. There is one such former agent by the name of John Stockwell. Mr. Stockwell is a 13-year veteran of the CIA and a former U.S. Marine Corps major. He has written several books and given multiple lectures on his experience within the CIA during the Cold War. I myself attended one of his lectures back in the late 1980s while still a student at California State University, Fresno. Let me read just one of the testimonials of his about the CIA and what they did during the Cold War. Okay, now the CIA, this is his, he goes on to tell the following story. The CIA spent 7 years in Brazil and 3 in Uruguay, teaching interrogation, teaching torture. They were supposed to be the masters of the business, how to apply the right amount of pain at just the right times in order to get the response you want from the individual. They gave them crank generators with U.S. aid written on the side, so the people even knew where these things came from, and developed a wire that was strong enough to carry the current and fine enough to fit between the teeth, so you could put one wire between the teeth and the other in or around the genitals. You could crank and submit the individual to the greatest amount of pain supposedly that the human body can register. One of the women who was in this program for 2 years, tortured in Brazil for 2 years, testified internationally when she eventually got out. She said the most horrible thing about it, in fact, was that the people doing it were not raving psychopaths. She couldn't break mental contact with them the way you could if they were psychopaths. They were very ordinary people. She told about being tortured one day. She's on the table, naked in a room full of 6 men, and they're doing these incredibly painful, degrading things to her body. There's an interruption. An American is called to the telephone, and he's in the next room, and the others take a smoke break. She's lying on this table, and he's saying, "Oh, hi, honey. Yes, I can wrap it up here in another hour or so and meet you and the kids at the ambassador's on the way home." There's a lesson in all this. The lesson is, it isn't just the Gestapo maniacs or the KGB maniacs who do inhumane things to other people. It's people who do inhumane things to other people. So again, this is an account that I just read by John Stockwell. Now, there's an old historical phrase that states, often we become like our worst enemies. In other words, one often uses the same methods to defeat an enemy that the enemy itself uses to harm them, even when the methods used are considered to be evil. This principle appears to be partially true during the Cold War. Was there really any difference between the methods used by the CIA and the KGB? So now we are faced with a new kind of enemy. Terror organizations controlled by extremist zealots. This new enemy has committed some of the most grave violations of human rights witnessed in the modern world. How are we going to defeat them? In this war, is there the risk of we ourselves resorting to the same cruel and inhumane methods that our enemies use against us. I personally have no love for these people who have committed such atrocities as rape, torture, and mass murder, all in the name of God. And I do want us to defeat them, but I want us to do so without becoming like them. Because this is not about them. This is about us, who we are. Now, my dad had a lot of old sayings that he used to say. I guess you could refer to it as old school wisdom. Well, when I was younger, I didn't always pay as much attention to what my dad was trying to teach me. But the older I get, the more I realize the value of my dad's simple teachings. One of these sayings my dad often used was, "Two wrongs don't make a right." So now we must question ourselves on the moral issues regarding torture. Are there circumstances that we as a nation are willing to accept the use of torture by any authority? Even torture in its mildest forms, if there is such a thing. Can we justify the use of torture by law enforcement if the circumstances call for it? What about as parents, even on our own children? For if the argument perpetrated by Dick Cheney and others that the enhanced interrogation techniques used by the CIA are not forms of torture and are not illegal, then what stops the police from using these same methods to extract confessions from suspects, or by a parent as a means of punishment to discipline their children? As it is now, of course, the answer is no. We do not allow any form of torture, cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment to be used by law enforcement, the military, or individual citizens, even in the worst of circumstances. Even if the crime committed is of the most hideous nature, we do not allow our law enforcement officers to use anything that resembles torture. So why the exception in the case of the CIA? Is it because the CIA is dealing with such creepy individuals? Which in many cases is true. The problem, though, is if you do creepy things to creepy people, you can't help but become a creep yourself. Let me repeat that. If you do creepy things to creepy people, you become a creep yourself. When you really study the nature of torture, there are some disturbing consistencies that become apparent. Almost universally throughout history, the victims of torture are stripped naked first. In addition, the methods of torture usually include some type of painful or degrading act done to the sexual organs and/or the anus. This is exemplified by electrical shock. The wires are often connected to the genitals. And in at least some of the interrogations conducted by the CIA, the victims were stripped naked and then fed a liquid food by the way of their anus. I don't know how everyone else sees this, but for me, these practices indicate a type of sadism, or in other words, some form of sexual stimulation by the use of cruelty. Of course, the people doing these acts claim that it is not for sadistic reasons, but rather solely for the purpose of dehumanizing the victim in order to make them more open to questioning. I say, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. And I definitely do not want such a person living next door to me as my neighbor. Now, it may be in the beginning that an interrogator using such methods does not start out to be a creepy person, but like so many things in life, if you do something over and over, you will eventually accept it as a norm, and you will change the very essence of who and what you are. So again, if you do creepy things to creepy people, you will become a creep yourself. Now let me summarize everything. First of all, it is clear by both the spirit of the law and the letter of the law that torture, cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment is illegal, both under international and U.S. law. That's very clear. Second, the question of whether or not the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques used by the CIA are in fact forms of torture, if answered by myself, is definitely yes. However, If we follow the principles of our Constitution, this question needs to be put forth before the Supreme Court for a legal interpretation. And besides, why did the CIA not use the alternative methods of interrogation that have been proven to be more effective, more reliable, and are legally, morally, and ethically sound? Methods that I myself have mastered and have used and know that they work. Next, we as a nation must ask ourselves, where do we go from here? How do we assure that an organization such as the CIA, that by its very nature works in total secrecy, does not violate the law or the principles that we as a nation hold dear? And finally, how do we go forward as a nation and as a leader on human rights and the moral high ground, even when faced with the worst of enemies who do not adhere to these same principles? These questions I address more to the younger generations of our nation. For the future of the United States of America is yours. Not mine or Dick Cheney's. We are old, with one foot in the grave already. It is for you, the leaders of the future, to decide where you're going to go from here. It is my hope that this vital topic is addressed and not forgotten, for history does repeat itself. And if this matter is not resolved now, then it is more than likely that we will witness more abuses by our nation in the future. The greatest fear is that next time it will not just be against our enemies, but perhaps the use of torture on our own citizens. I don't think this is what President Reagan wanted when in 1988 he signed the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. And I don't think this is what the majority of the American people want either. This is Robert Ashoy. Thank you for listening, and I welcome your comments on this essential topic.